You see the yellow flag rising on your ship's mast, and your blood turns to ice. It's not your flag. The harbour master's boat just hoisted it for you. That piece of yellow fabric just became your death sentence. The year is 1665. You're trapped on a merchant vessel approaching Venice, and someone in the cargo hold started vomiting blood 3 hours ago. The authorities already know. They've been watching through telescopes from the moment your ship appeared on the horizon. Now armed guards are rowing toward you, but not to help. They're coming to make sure no one leaves this ship alive for the next 40 days. 40 days. You're a healthy person, you feel fine, but that doesn't matter anymore. You're now locked in a floating prison with 200 other souls, contaminated water, rotting food, and a disease that kills in 3 days. The worst part, the yellow flag isn't just a warning to others, it's a timer. Every single day you survive brings you closer to freedom, but also deeper into hell. Because on a quarantine ship, the disease isn't what kills most people. It's everything else that happens when you lock terrified humans in a wooden box and tell them to wait for death. The guards circling your ship have orders to shoot anyone who tries to swim for shore. The captain just locked himself in his cabin with all the good food. The man next to you is eyeing the last barrel of clean water. And that person who is vomiting blood, they're not isolated. They're down below with 50 others, and you can hear the screaming starting. Welcome to quarantine, 1665 style. You probably won't make it to day 3, let alone day 40. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about maritime quarantine. The system that just condemned you to probable death started in Venice 3 centuries earlier. In 1377, the Venetians watched ships arrive from the east carrying more than just silk and spices. They carried death that could empty a city in weeks. The Black Death had already killed 1/3 of Europe, and Venice, the maritime jewel of the Mediterranean, decided it wouldn't be next. The solution they created was elegant in its cruelty. Any ship arriving from a plague-infected port would anchor in the lagoon and wait. Not for days, not for weeks, for 40 giorni, 40 days, the biblical number. The same length of time Christ spent in the desert. Noah watched rainfall, and Moses stayed on Mount Sinai. 40 days to prove you weren't carrying the seeds of apocalypse in your blood. But you're not thinking about biblical parallels right now. You're watching those guard boats form a circle around your vessel, their muskets trained on your deck. The Venetian health magistrates, the provveditori alla sanità, have absolute power over your fate. These aren't doctors, they're administrators, politicians, men who measure lives in economic calculations. Your ship represents potential profit, but also potential catastrophe. The silk in your hold could make merchants rich, or the disease in your lungs could kill thousands. For them, it's simple mathematics. Your 200 lives against Venice's 100,000. You already know how that calculation ends. The yellow flag system spread across every major port in Europe, like its own kind of contagion. Marseille, London, Hamburg, Lisbon. Each city developed its own variations, but the core remained constant. Yellow meant pestilence. Yellow meant isolation. Yellow meant you were no longer fully human in the eyes of the law. You had entered a legal limbo where normal rights ceased to exist. The captain of your ship, who yesterday had the power of God at sea, now can't even drop anchor without permission. The wealthy merchant who owns half the cargo and usually buys his way out of any trouble. His gold means nothing to the harbour guards. The pregnant woman in steerage who needs a midwife. She'll give birth on these rotting planks or die trying. The moment that flag went up, your ship transformed. What was once a vessel of commerce became a floating lazaretto, named after the biblical Lazarus who rose from the dead, though most who entered the original lazarettos never experienced resurrection. The guards rowing toward you aren't coming to explain the rules. There are no rules anymore, only procedures. They're bringing supplies, but not the kind you want. Sulfur for fumigation, vinegar for purification, lime for the bodies that will start accumulating by day 3. They'll throw these supplies onto your deck from a safe distance, 20 feet minimum, because even the guards fear what you might be carrying. The chief health officer stands in his boat, far enough away that you can barely hear him over the waves. He's reading from a proclamation, the same words delivered to every quarantine ship for 300 years. Any attempt to leave the ship will result in immediate execution. Any attempt to transfer goods or messages without authorization will add another 40 days to your sentence. Any violence against the guards will result in the ship being burned with all souls aboard. He doesn't look at you while he reads. To him, you're already ghosts. You want to scream that you're healthy, that you've never even been near the sick passengers in the hold. But health is no longer a medical condition. It's a bureaucratic classification. The ship has been marked, and everyone on it shares the same designation: suspected. Not sick, not healthy, but suspended in between, waiting for biology to deliver its verdict. The rich passengers who paid for private cabins are already trying to bribe the guards, offering fortunes for a single rowboat to shore. The guards don't even respond. They've seen this performance too many times. They know that gold coins can carry plague just as easily as human hands. The inspection official makes his assessment from a distance, using a telescope to count bodies on deck. He's looking for signs, not just of disease, but of disorder. How many crew versus passengers? Are weapons visible? Is the captain maintaining control? These observations go into a ledger that will determine your fate. If too many die, they might extend the quarantine. If violence breaks out, they might sink the ship. If you somehow survive 40 days, you might earn the right to move to a lazaretto on land, which, truthfully, might be worse than staying on the ship. As the sun sets on your first day under the yellow flag, reality begins to settle in like fog. The water barrels you thought would last weeks are already tasting brackish. The ship's movement has slowed to almost nothing, anchored far from shore but close enough to see the city lights that might as well be on another planet. Below deck, that first sick passenger isn't alone anymore. 3 others have started showing symptoms: fever, chills, swellings in the neck and groin. The ship's doctor, if you can call a barber surgeon with bloodletting tools a doctor, has locked himself in a storage room. He knows what those symptoms mean. Everyone knows. The quarantine system wasn't designed with mercy in mind. It was designed with mathematics. If a disease kills in 3 days and you isolate people for 40, then only the healthy will emerge. Simple, logical, effective. The fact that cramming 200 people into a confined space with limited food, water, and sanitation might create other problems, that's not the city's concern. The yellow flag doesn't just mark disease, it marks the boundary between civilization and chaos, between those worth saving and those who must be sacrificed for the greater good. Chapter 2. Welcome to your floating prison. By the morning of day 2, the geography of your new world has become clear. The ship, which seemed spacious enough during the voyage, has transformed into a series of territories and boundaries. The wealthy passengers have barricaded themselves in the stern cabins, pooling their private food supplies and posting servants as guards. The crew controls the deck and the rigging, but half of them are talking about swimming for shore under cover of darkness, until they remember the guard boats have orders to shoot swimmers on sight. The steerage passengers, packed into the festering hold like human cargo, have already split into factions based on nationality, language, and who they blame for bringing the sickness aboard. You need to understand something about ship design in 1665. These aren't the massive vessels you might imagine. Your merchant ship is perhaps 120 feet long and 30 feet wide. Into this wooden box are crammed 200 souls, their possessions, trade goods, livestock that's still alive, barrels of increasingly putrid water, and food supplies that were questionable even before the quarantine began. The height between decks in steerage is perhaps 5 feet. Most men can't stand upright. The air doesn't circulate, it festers. Even before disease arrived, sailing ships were breeding grounds for every conceivable ailment. Now trapped at anchor without the wind to carry away the stench, your floating prison has become something far worse. The water situation reveals itself as the first true crisis. Ships typically carried water in wooden casks, and seawater would seep through the wood, making fresh water brackish over time. Usually, ships could resupply at ports, but you're not going anywhere. The captain makes an announcement. Water rations are now half of what they were during sailing, a pint per person per day. In the Mediterranean heat, working men need at least a gallon to stay healthy. Do the mathematics yourself. The stored water was already 3 weeks old when you were quarantined. By day 40, if you make it that far, you'll be drinking liquid that tastes like it was drained from a corpse. But water is only part of your problem. The food supplies tell their own story of degradation. Ship's biscuit, that rock-hard staple of maritime life, is already showing signs of weevil infestation. The small white worms are considered extra protein by experienced sailors, but watching them writhe through your only reliable food source does something to your mind. The salted meat, preserved in brine, has turned a suspicious grey colour. The few vegetables brought aboard have long since rotted. The live chickens kept for fresh eggs. They're dying faster than the humans, their bodies tossed overboard to float past the guard boats like feathered omens. The air quality, already abysmal, becomes a weapon of slow murder. The prevailing medical theory of your time is that disease spreads through miasma, bad air. The truth, which won't be discovered for another 2 centuries, is both better and worse. Yes, the air carries disease, but not in the way your contemporaries believe. Every cough sprays invisible droplets carrying plague bacteria. Every breath in the confined space below deck is a gamble. The authorities' solution? Fumigation with sulphur. Twice a day, sulphur is burned in metal pans throughout the ship. The yellow smoke is supposed to purify the air. Instead, it sears your lungs, causes violent coughing, which spreads more disease, and makes the already unbreathable atmosphere toxic. People rush to the deck gasping, only to be ordered below by guards who think fresh air might somehow spread plague to the city. The sleeping arrangements become a daily negotiation with death. Below deck, humans are packed into rows of wooden shelves called berths, 18 inches wide per person. You're literally sleeping in a honeycomb of humanity. The person above you might be dying. The person below you might already be dead. Nobody's checking too carefully because checking means getting close, and getting close means accepting risk. At night, the ship becomes a symphony of suffering. Coughing, moaning, praying in a dozen languages. The splash of waste buckets being emptied over the side. The scurrying of rats that seem to multiply despite the lack of food. Ah, yes, the rats. Your uninvited passengers who will outlive most of the human ones. They've been on ships as long as humans have sailed, but now they're not just pests, they're competitors for resources. They gnaw through food stores, contaminate water supplies with their droppings, and carry fleas that, unknown to you, are the actual vectors of plague. The ship's cats, brought aboard to control the rat population, were the first to die when the sickness arrived. Without their predators, the rats grow bold. They run across sleeping bodies. They feast on the dead before they can be discovered. They're winning the evolutionary contest that your quarantine has become. Sanitation, never a strong point on sailing ships, has completely collapsed. The heads, the toilet facilities at the bow of the ship, are wooden seats with holes that drop waste directly into the sea. But with the ship at anchor, the waste doesn't disperse. It accumulates around the hull, creating a floating cesspool that attracts flies and breeds disease. The chamber pots used by those too sick or frightened to go above deck are supposed to be emptied regularly. But who's going to volunteer for that duty? They overflow. They spill. They turn the lower decks into a literal hell of human waste and desperation. The guards deliver supplies every 3 days, but it's a cruel pantomime of care. They row close enough to throw bundles onto the deck. Hard bread that's already moulding, barrels of water that taste like they were filled from a swamp, more sulphur for fumigation, more lime for the bodies. They also bring vinegar, lots of vinegar. The authorities believe vinegar prevents plague. You're ordered to wash with it, gargle with it, sprinkle it on your clothes. The ship reeks of vinegar and death, a combination that will haunt your nightmares if you survive. The guards always count heads during these deliveries. Not names. You've lost your names, just numbers. How many on deck, how many visible below, how many unaccounted for. The arithmetic of attrition. Personal hygiene becomes a forgotten luxury. There's no fresh water for washing. Salt water causes sores and infections. Your clothes, the same ones you've worn since the quarantine began, are stiff with sweat, blood, and things you don't want to identify. Lice are everywhere. In your hair, your beard, the seams of your clothes. They're not just uncomfortable, they carry typhus, another disease that thrives in these conditions. Some passengers strip naked rather than endure the constant itching. Others have given up entirely, sitting in their own filth, waiting for whatever end comes first. Day 7 brings unexpected movement. The guard boats are approaching with something different. Not supplies, but orders. You're being transferred. The word lazaretto ripples through the ship like a wave of both hope and horror. Some celebrate, thinking anything must be better than this floating coffin. Others who've heard stories from previous plagues go silent. They know the truth. You're not being rescued, you're being sorted. The lazaretto system is Venice's grand innovation in organised cruelty, copied by every major port from Marseille to Malta. These aren't hospitals, they're processing facilities for the possibly damned. The original Lazaretto Vecchio, built on an island in the Venetian lagoon in 1423, became the template for controlled death management. Islands were perfect. Water formed a natural barrier. Escape was nearly impossible. If things went wrong, if the plague spread uncontrollably, the authorities could simply stop sending food and let nature take its course. 40,000 bodies are buried on Lazaretto Vecchio. The soil is more human ash than earth. Your transfer begins at dawn. Not everyone is going. The guards have been watching, calculating, deciding who might be worth saving and who's already lost. The obviously sick are staying on the ship. It's been redesignated as a plague vessel, a floating cemetery waiting to happen. Those showing no symptoms, about 60 of you, are being moved to the lazaretto for observation. The remaining 100 or so occupy a grey zone, not sick enough to abandon, not healthy enough to process. They'll wait on the ship for another assessment in 7 days, if they're still alive. The selection process is performed at distance. A health inspector in a boat 50 feet away uses a long pole with a hook to turn people's faces toward him. He's looking for buboes, the characteristic swellings of plague, but he's also looking for something else. Economic value. Merchants who can pay higher fees get selected for transfer. Skilled craftsmen the city needs are chosen over common labourers. Young women of marriageable age are picked over elderly widows. You're not being evaluated as humans, but as potential assets or liabilities to the state. The inspector points with his pole. You step forward or step back. Life or death, determined by a gesture. The journey to the lazaretto is designed to break whatever spirit you have left. You're loaded into flat-bottomed boats, packed tightly, but not allowed to sit. Sitting might show weakness, and weakness might mean disease. The guards row in a separate boat, crossbows aimed at your vessel. The message is clear: your cargo, potentially contaminated cargo. The main city slides past like a dream you can't quite remember. Church bells ring the hour. Normal life continues just a few hundred yards away. Children play on the waterfront. Merchants haggle in the markets. The world hasn't ended. It just ended for you. The lazaretto appears through morning mist like something from a fever dream. High walls topped with iron spikes. Guard towers at each corner. A single entrance gate that looks more like a mouth waiting to swallow you. This isn't the original Lazaretto Vecchio. That's reserved for the confirmed dying. You're heading to Lazaretto Nuovo, the new facility for suspects and goods quarantine, though new is relative since it's been operating for 200 years. The stones are stained with the residue of countless fumigations. The walls are scratched with the desperate messages of previous occupants. Giovanni lived 23 days. God has abandoned this place. Mother, I'm sorry. The entrance procedure strips away your last pretense of dignity. You're separated by gender first, then by class, then by perceived health. Everyone must strip naked. Your clothes are taken for fumigation. They'll be boiled in vinegar, dried over sulphur fires, and returned to you if you survive, though they'll never feel clean again. You stand naked in lines while inspectors examine you with long poles, looking for signs of disease. They check your neck, your groin, your armpits, the places where plague announces itself. The inspection is performed in full view of everyone. Modesty is a luxury the quarantined can't afford. The financial assessment comes next. Quarantine isn't free. The Venetian Republic, ever practical, decided that suspected plague carriers should pay for their own detention. The fee structure is precisely calculated. Wealthy merchants pay 20 ducats per day for private rooms with windows. Middle-class passengers pay 5 ducats for shared rooms with 4 to 6 occupants. The poor, who can't pay anything, are housed in common wards that are essentially stone barns with straw on the floor. But here's the cruelest part. Even if you can't pay, you still owe. If you survive, you're not released until someone pays your debt. If you die, your family inherits the obligation. The lazaretto is a business, and business must be maintained even during apocalypse. Your assigned quarters reveal the hierarchy of suffering. The private rooms aren't much: stone cells with a single window, a straw mattress, and a bucket. But they offer the luxury of dying alone if it comes to that. The shared rooms force you into intimate proximity with strangers who might be carrying death in their breath. The common wards are scenes from Dante's imagination. Hundreds of people crammed into spaces designed for dozens. No beds, just straw that hasn't been changed in weeks. No windows, just air holes near the ceiling that let in rain and cold, but never enough fresh air. The walls sweat with condensation from too many bodies breathing in too small a space. The daily routine is designed to maintain order through exhaustion. Wake at dawn for roll call. Guards count from outside, never entering. Morning fumigation fills your quarters with sulphur smoke for an hour. You stand outside in the courtyard, coughing and gasping, while your living space becomes temporarily uninhabitable. Breakfast is bread and water, thrown over the wall in bundles. No one enters the lazaretto except the condemned. Even the guards stay outside, patrolling the walls, watching through windows, maintaining the barrier between the possibly infected and the certainly living. Medical treatment, such as it is performed by plague doctors who've already survived the disease and thus believe themselves immune. They dress like leather birds, long coats, gloves, and those distinctive beaked masks filled with herbs and spices that supposedly filter the bad air. They look like death's messenger, and often they are. Their treatments are based on humoral theory, bloodletting to remove bad blood, purgatives to expel evil humours, mercury rubs that cause more damage than any plague. The lucky ones are left alone to let their bodies fight without interference. The unlucky ones receive the full medical treatment and die from the cure. The economics of the lazaretto create their own ecosystem of corruption. Guards can be bribed to deliver better food, cleaner water, messages to the outside world. But the bribes must be substantial because any guard caught breaking quarantine rules faces execution. The coins must be washed in vinegar, passed through fire, and left to purify for days before the guards will touch them. Even corruption has its protocols. Some inmates become intermediaries, taking a cut for facilitating bribes, creating a black market economy in hope and desperation. A clean blanket costs a gold ducat. A letter smuggled out costs 5. A chance to escape, that's negotiable, but only if you're very rich and very desperate. Chapter 4, Days 15 to 30. The breaking point? By day 15, the arithmetic of survival has become clear. Of the 60 people transferred to the lazaretto with you, 43 are still alive. The ship you left behind has gone silent. No smoke from cooking fires, no movement on deck. The guards stopped checking it 3 days ago. Everyone understands what that means. Your floating prison has become a floating tomb. Another ghost ship to be towed out to sea and burned when the quarantine period ends. The social order, already fragile, begins its complete collapse around day 18. It starts with the water. The cisterns that supply the lazaretto are running low. They always do when too many people are confined for too long. The guards announce water rationing. 1 cup at dawn, 1 at dusk. That's not enough to survive in the Mediterranean heat. People start hoarding, stealing, fighting over drops. A merchant who's been bribing guards for extra rations is found beaten unconscious, his private water stash distributed among the common ward. The authorities' response is swift and merciless. The suspected attackers are moved to the plague ward, whether they're sick or not. It's a death sentence delivered without trial. Sleep becomes impossible as paranoia takes hold. Everyone watches everyone. That person coughing. Is it dust or disease? That woman scratching. Is it lice or the beginning of buboes? Every human behaviour becomes suspicious. Some people stop eating, convinced the food is contaminated. Others eat ravenously, believing they need strength for the fight ahead. Groups form based on theories of survival. One faction believes constant movement prevents the disease from settling in the body. They pace endlessly, driving everyone mad with their footsteps. Another group prays continuously, convinced that sufficient piety will earn God's protection. Their prayers become a droning soundtrack to despair. The first suicide happens on day 20. A young merchant's son, maybe 17, manages to climb the wall at night and throw himself off. His body lies broken in the courtyard until noon the next day, a warning or a temptation, depending on your state of mind. The guards don't remove bodies immediately anymore. They wait for them to accumulate, for efficiency. The death cart comes every 3 days now, and the bodies are stacked like cordwood against the wall. The lime scattered over them doesn't hide the smell. Nothing hides that smell. By day 22, the segregation between healthy and sick has completely broken down. There aren't enough guards to maintain the boundaries, and honestly, the guards have stopped caring. They know what everyone pretends not to know. Most of you are already infected. It's just a matter of when symptoms appear. The plague ward, visible through barred windows, has become a vision of hell. The sick lie in their own waste, too weak to move. The dying crawl over the dead trying to reach water buckets that are always empty. The only medical attention is a daily visit from a plague doctor who primarily confirms deaths and marks bodies for removal. The psychological breakdown is worse than the physical suffering. A woman becomes convinced her dead child is still alive, carrying a bundle of rags she rocks and sings to. A priest loses his faith publicly, screaming that God is dead or worse, that God enjoys watching suffering. He's removed by guards, but his words echo in everyone's minds during the endless nights. Some people simply stop responding, sitting against walls with empty eyes, alive but no longer living. Others become hyperactive, talking constantly, making plans for when they're released, describing in detail the meals they'll eat, the baths they'll take, the loved ones they'll embrace. Everyone knows they're lying to themselves, but the lies are better than silence. The economy of survival becomes brutal. Food meant for the dead is quickly claimed by the living. Clothes from corpses are stripped and traded before the bodies are cold. A black market in clean papers, documents certifying health, emerges among guards and inmates. For enough gold, you can buy a certificate saying you've completed quarantine and shown no symptoms. The fact that these papers are obvious forgeries doesn't matter. Desperate people will believe any lie that offers escape. Day 25 brings a new horror. The children's ward has gone quiet. There were 12 children in the lazaretto, separated from parents who may or may not still be alive. The authorities don't announce what happened. They don't need to. The small bodies on the death cart tell the story. One mother breaks through 3 sets of doors, trying to reach her daughter's body. The guards don't stop her. They know she's already dead. She just hasn't accepted it yet. She holds her child's corpse for hours before the fever takes her. They're burned together the next day. Escape attempts become more desperate and creative. A group tries to tunnel under the walls using spoons and broken pottery. They manage 3 feet before hitting solid rock. Another man covers himself in lime and lies among the corpses, hoping to be carried out with the dead. He's discovered when he coughs. His punishment is immediate placement in the plague ward. A wealthy woman bribes a guard with jewellery to smuggle her out in a supply barrel. The guard takes the jewellery and reports her. She's not punished. She's simply locked in a storage room alone, which might be worse. The food, never good, becomes actively harmful. The bread is more mould than grain. Weevils have consumed what little nutrition remained in the ship's biscuit. The salted meat has turned black and smells like death itself. But you eat it anyway because starvation weakens the body's defences and weakness means death. Some people have started catching and eating the rats. They joke darkly that the rats have been eating better than the humans, feeding on corpses and food stores alike. The meat is stringy and tastes of disease, but it's protein. Religious mania reaches its peak around day 28. Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim. Previous divisions mean nothing now. Everyone prays to whatever power might listen. A charismatic inmate claims to have received visions of salvation. He promises that those who follow his rituals will be spared. His rituals involve bloodletting, self-flagellation, and drinking vinegar mixed with urine. Desperate people try it. They die at the same rate as everyone else, but at least they die believing in something. The guards have developed their own coping mechanisms. They're drunk most of the time now, stealing wine meant for medical use. They take bets on who will die next, creating elaborate gambling pools based on symptoms, demographics, and behaviour. One guard has started a ledger recording last words, claiming he'll publish it as a book when the plague ends. He offers people the chance to have their final statements recorded for a price. Many pay, desperate to leave some trace of their existence beyond a lime-covered corpse in a mass grave. Chapter 5. The final days. Day 30 arrives like a fever breaking. You've survived longer than statistics said you should. Of the original 60 transferred to the lazaretto, 19 remain who show no obvious symptoms. You're one of them, though healthy is a relative term now. You've lost perhaps a third of your body weight. Your hair is falling out from malnutrition. Open sores cover your skin from lice bites and the constant exposure to lime and vinegar. But you don't have buboes. You don't have the fever. Somehow through luck or providence or simple biological randomness, the plague has passed you by. Now you just need to survive 10 more days of quarantine. The authorities conduct a new assessment, their first thorough inspection in a week. The healthy-looking survivors are moved to a different section of the lazaretto, the convalescent ward, though none of you were ever technically sick. It's cleaner here marginally. The straw is only a week old. The walls have been whitewashed with lime recently enough that you can still smell it burning your nostrils. There are actual beds, just wooden planks, but after sleeping on stone and straw, they feel like luxury. The water ration increases to 3 cups a day. You might actually make it. But the psychological damage is harder to assess than the physical. You've watched over 40 people die in ways that will haunt whatever life remains to you. You've seen mothers abandon sick children to save themselves. You've seen priests steal food from the dying. You've seen what happens when civilization's thin veneer cracks and reveals the animal beneath. Some survivors have gone completely silent, unable or unwilling to process what they've witnessed. Others talk obsessively, narrating every detail as if speaking it aloud will somehow exorcise the memories. You find yourself somewhere in between, functional but hollow, going through the motions of survival without remembering why survival matters. The final days bring their own unique tortures. Freedom is visible now, countable, which makes every hour feel like a day. You can see the normal world from the windows of the convalescent ward. Fishing boats heading out at dawn, merchants conducting business on distant docks. Life continuing as if the last 30 days were just a nightmare you haven't quite woken from. The guards tell you that if you make it to day 40 without symptoms, you'll be released with papers certifying your health. You can return to whatever remains of your former life. The "if" in that sentence carries more weight than the rest combined. Day 33 brings unexpected drama. 3 survivors who seemed healthy suddenly develop fevers. The speed of their decline is shocking, from walking and talking at breakfast to delirious by sunset. They're immediately removed to the plague ward, but everyone knows what their sickness means. You've all been exposed again. The quarantine clock might reset. Another 40 days. The thought breaks something in the group's collective psyche. A fight erupts over nothing. Someone looked at someone wrong. Someone took more than their share of bread. It doesn't matter. 19 survivors become 16, as 3 are beaten badly enough to require removal to the injury ward, which is just another way of saying plague ward, since injured people don't survive in these conditions. The authorities' response is swift and pragmatic. They separate the remaining 16 into individual cells. Solitary confinement for the last week. It's for your own protection, they claim, to prevent violence and ensure clean documentation of who survives. But you understand the real reason. Individual cells make it easier to track who dies, easier to prevent the spread if someone develops late-stage symptoms, easier to clean up when it's over. You're being stored like goods in a warehouse, kept separate to prevent contamination from spreading to the entire shipment. Solitary confinement in a lazaretto cell is its own form of plague. The cell is 6 feet by 8 feet, stone walls, stone floor, a bucket for waste, a water jug refilled once daily, food pushed through a slot in the door, no human contact, no voices except your own. The only window is a slit near the ceiling that shows a rectangle of sky that changes from blue to black to blue again, marking days that feel identical. Some people handle it by creating elaborate routines, counting stones, doing exercises, reciting every prayer or poem they remember. Others sink into themselves, becoming catatonic, alive but absent. You develop your own survival mechanism. Mathematics. You count everything. Stones in the wall. 1,247. Breaths per minute. 14 when calm, 23 when anxious. Steps from wall to wall. Exactly 4.5. Hours remaining until day 40, 168, then 167, then 166. The numbers become a mantra, a barrier between your mind and the memories trying to break through. When you run out of things to count, you start calculating. If 200 people started on the ship, and 60 were transferred, and 19 made it to day 30, what percentage survived? The math says 9.5%. You recalculate obsessively, hoping for a different answer, but mathematics doesn't care about hope. Day 37 brings the cruelest revelation. A guard drunk enough to be honest tells you something that makes everything worse. The 40-day quarantine isn't actually 40 days. It's 40 days from the last recorded death or new infection. Every time someone died in your ward, the clock reset for everyone. You've actually been in quarantine for 53 days. The original 40 days was just for the ship. The lazaretto started its own count. And if those 3 people who developed fevers on day 33 die, which they probably will, the count starts again. You might be here forever, trapped in a mathematical loop of disease and death. This news breaks the last 2 survivors who'd maintained any semblance of sanity. One begins screaming and doesn't stop until his voice gives out. He continues trying to scream even without sound, his mouth open in a silent howl that's somehow worse than noise. The other becomes convinced he's already dead, that the lazaretto is purgatory, that he's being punished for sins he can't remember. He stops eating, stops drinking, stops moving. By day 39, both are gone. One to madness, one to self-imposed starvation. Day 39 brings a visitor you didn't expect. A priest who's not infected, not quarantined, but here by choice. He's old, perhaps 70, with eyes that have seen too many plagues. He tells you he's performed last rites in every major outbreak for 40 years. He's not here to save your soul. He's here to document. The church keeps records of plagues, tracking patterns, looking for signs of God's will or the devil's work. He asks you questions through the door slot, not about symptoms or suffering, but about what you've learned. What does extreme suffering teach about human nature? What remains when everything is stripped away? You don't have answers, only observations, but he writes them down anyway. The final assessment comes at dawn on day 40. Or is it day 55? You've lost track of which count matters. A senior health magistrate arrives with a full escort. This is different from the cursory inspections you've endured. This is the judgment. You're ordered to strip, to stand in full sunlight while multiple inspectors examine every inch of your skin. They check your tongue, your eyes, your pulse. They make you urinate in a clear vessel to examine the colour and clarity. They ask you to recite your name, your origin, your profession, checking for mental deterioration. Every answer is recorded in triplicate. Chapter 6. The System's Dark Logic. The truth about maritime quarantine, the truth that no one speaks aloud but everyone eventually understands, is that it works. Not for the individuals trapped within it, your acceptable casualties in a larger war, but for the cities that implement it. The mathematics are undeniable. Venice, which perfected the quarantine system, avoided the worst of multiple plague outbreaks that devastated other European cities. Milan, which implemented similar measures, survived when neighbouring cities lost half their populations. The system is cruel, inhuman and effective. You learn this from the health magistrate who signs your release papers. He's a young man, educated in Padua, who views quarantine through the lens of natural philosophy, rather than theology. To him, you're not a person, but a data point in a grand experiment. He explains with disturbing enthusiasm how the 40-day period was calculated. Plague typically manifests within 2 to 6 days of infection. 40 days ensures multiple incubation periods pass. If disease hasn't appeared by then, it's statistically unlikely to appear at all. The fact that most people die from other causes during those 40 days, starvation, violence, secondary infections, suicide, is irrelevant to the equation. The city remains protected. The release process is as dehumanizing as the entry. You're given a certificate of health, a document more valuable than gold in a plague-time economy. It states that you've completed quarantine and shown no signs of pestilence. It doesn't mention the 19 people who started with you and didn't make it. It doesn't mention the months of your life lost to bureaucratic paranoia. It's simply a permission slip to rejoin humanity. But first, there are fees to pay. Quarantine isn't free, remember. Your 40 or 55 days of suffering have accrued costs: food, water, housing, medical inspections, body removal, fumigation. The total is more than most people earn in a year. If you can't pay, you have options, none of them good. You can sign an indenture contract, essentially selling yourself into slavery until the debt is cleared. You can appeal to religious charities, though they're overwhelmed with similar requests. You can try to contact family or business associates, assuming any survived and still acknowledge you. Many quarantine survivors discover that their families have already declared them dead, divided their assets, and moved on. The living ghost of a plague ship survivor, returning to claim their former life, is rarely welcome. The physical examination before release reveals the true cost of survival. The doctor, a university-trained physician who actually knows something about medicine, documents your condition with clinical detachment. Severe malnutrition has caused scurvy. Your gums bleed, old wounds won't heal, your teeth are loose. Prolonged exposure to fumigation chemicals has damaged your lungs. You'll wheeze for the rest of your life. The constant stress has aged you a decade in 2 months. Your hair has gone grey. Your hands shake uncontrollably. You've developed a peculiar sensitivity to sounds. Any sudden noise sends you into panic. These are the badges of survival, worn by every person who's passed through the quarantine system. But the system doesn't care about individual suffering, because it's not designed for individuals. It's designed for cities, for trade, for the continuation of commerce and governance. The magistrate shows you charts and figures, proud of the bureaucratic achievement. During this outbreak, 15,000 people were processed through various quarantine facilities. 12,000 died. But, and here's where his eyes light up, the city itself lost only 300 citizens to plague. Without quarantine, based on previous outbreaks, they would have lost 30,000. You want to ask if the 12,000 who died in quarantine weren't citizens, weren't people worth protecting. But you already know the answer. The reintegration into society is harder than the quarantine itself. You're marked now, visibly and invisibly. The certificate of health you carry might as well be a brand. Everyone knows what it means. You're a plague ship survivor. Mothers pull their children away when you pass. Merchants refuse to touch money from your hands. Innkeepers claim they're full when you seek lodging. The church welcomes you, but even there, you're given a special section. Away from the congregation, you're legally clean but socially contaminated, forever associated with disease and death. Work is almost impossible to find. No one wants to employ someone who's been in close contact with plague, certificate or not. The skills you had before, maybe you were a clerk, a craftsman, a merchant, are useless if no one will let you practice them. Many survivors end up in the only professions that will take them: grave digging, plague nursing, or working in the quarantine facilities themselves. The system that nearly killed you becomes your only means of survival. It's a bitter irony that doesn't escape anyone. The psychological scars manifest in unexpected ways. You can't tolerate enclosed spaces. They remind you of the ship's hold, the lazaretto cell. The smell of vinegar causes violent nausea. The sight of yellow fabric, any yellow fabric, triggers panic attacks. You've developed a compulsive need to count things, to calculate ratios and percentages, as if mathematics could somehow protect you from chaos. Sleep brings nightmares of bodies stacked like cordwood, of children's wards gone silent, of that woman singing to her bundle of rags. You wake screaming, then remember you're free, then wonder if free is the right word for what you've become. Some survivors form communities, gathering in taverns that will serve them, sharing stories that no one else wants to hear. You recognise each other instantly. The hollow eyes, the involuntary flinch at sudden movements, the way you all sit facing doors. You don't talk about the quarantine directly. Instead, you speak in code about the 40 days or the yellow time. Everyone understands. These gatherings are part support group, part wake for the people you used to be, before you learned what humans become when civilization stops protecting them. The authorities, meanwhile, are already preparing for the next outbreak. The lazarettos are being cleaned, fumigated, restocked. New regulations are being written based on lessons learned from this quarantine. The magistrate who released you is working on a treatise about optimal quarantine duration, suggesting that 40 days might be reduced to 30, with proper fumigation protocols. He's using data from your suffering to optimise future suffering, to make the system more efficient at sorting the living from the dying. When you point out that more people died from quarantine conditions than from plague, he nods enthusiastically. Yes, he says, but they died in isolation, away from the city. The system worked perfectly. The ultimate irony comes months later when you learn the truth about disease transmission. A physician from Holland publishes observations suggesting that plague spreads not through air, but through flea bites from infected rats. The fumigations, the vinegar, the isolation of humans while rats moved freely. It was all wrong. The quarantine worked not because of what the authorities did, but in spite of it. 40 days was enough time for infected fleas to die off, for rat populations to crash, for the disease to burn itself out. You survived not because the system saved you, but because you were lucky enough to avoid the fleas while being systematically tortured for 40 days. But this knowledge changes nothing. The next plague outbreak brings the same response. Yellow flags, guard boats, 40 days of isolation. The system doesn't adapt because the system doesn't need to. It works for those it's designed to protect. The fact that it's based on completely wrong understanding of disease, that it causes unnecessary suffering, that most who enter don't leave, these are acceptable inefficiencies in the grand machinery of urban survival. Cities need trade to survive. Trade brings disease. Disease requires management. Management requires sacrifice. You were the sacrifice. The system worked. You've just lived through 40 days of historical hell. But here's what should terrify you. This system lasted for 500 years. 5 centuries of yellow flags and floating prisons. 5 centuries of people just like you calculating survival odds that always favoured the house. From Venice in 1377 to Ellis Island in 1892, the basic formula never changed. Isolate the suspicious, sacrifice the few, protect the many. We look back at these plague ships and lazarettos as medieval barbarism, but the logic that created them is still alive in every emergency protocol, every triage decision, every moment when society decides who's worth saving and who becomes a statistic. You think you would survive because you're modern, educated, clean. You have antibiotics and hand sanitizer and the germ theory of disease. But strip away those advantages, put yourself in that wooden box floating in a harbour, and you'd face the same mathematical certainty that killed 90% of quarantine prisoners. Not from plague, from the cure, from the system designed to save everyone except you. The next time you see a yellow warning sign, a quarantine notice, a barrier between the healthy and the suspected, remember that someone always pays the price for collective safety. In 1665, it was those 200 souls on a merchant ship. Today, tomorrow, in the next crisis, it could be you. If this story kept you watching, if you need to know more about humanity's darkest survival moments, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Next week, I'm taking you inside the Donner Party's final camp. Not the story you learned in school, but what the survivors' journals really say about those last 20 days. Some histories are too dark for textbooks, but they're exactly what we need to understand who we really are when civilization stops protecting us. The algorithm won't recommend these stories. Only you can choose to hear them. Subscribe now, before you forget what 40 days of quarantine really means.